So yesterday I had a knockdown, drag-out conversation or exchange with Microsoft Copilot about the historical Jesuses and also the pagan parallels to Jesus. And anyway, so I'll cover it here. Basically, my assertion is that whereas Christians ask others to come to know Jesus, and Christians claim to know Jesus, it's evident from the historical Jesus industry's output that no one really knows Jesus. So Jesus just becomes this paper doll that they dress up in whatever garb will appeal to their target audience or target demographic in order to promote their book sales. So he's really just a dumb, mute idol that is absent, tardy, and impotent. This Jesus is powerless to defend his own identity, or at least he doesn't seem to want to. If he's still alive, which I don't think that he is. And he's certainly not reigning here on Earth as a world king of peace. Instead, he needs Christian deputies, shills, to defend his supposed messiahship, when if he would just be here and rule as king, he wouldn't need that, because everyone in the world would know that he was the Messiah. So anyway, we'll go over this. Below is a taxonomic maximalist catalog of how Jesus has been portrayed in historical Jesus research from the Enlightenment onward. I am deliberately inclusive. This list spans mainstream, academic, speculative, revisionist, popular, ideological, and fringe reconstructions. Some categories overlap. Many portraits combine elements of several types. That overlap is not a flaw. It is itself a historically observed feature of the field. I group these portrayals into families of interpretation. Note typical proponents and flag status, mainstream to fringe. Where possible, categories correspond to classifications already used in the scholarly literature. So the first one, this falls within the early rationalist and Enlightenment portraits from the 18th to the 19th century. One styles the historical Jesus as a failed political messiah, styles Jesus as a Jewish nationalist seeking political liberation from Rome, who failed and was executed. And this was pushed by Herman Samuel Ramirez. I'm assuming those aren't three different people, but just one. Status, historically foundational, now largely rejected as reductive. So, these historical Jesuses, they're like in a revolving door. They're in one day and then out the next, as the next popular historical Jesus comes along. 2, Jesus as a ethical teacher or moral reformer. And what I find going down this list is a lot of these things are merely just assets of the New Testament Jesus, and the scholars are just choosing to emphasize one of these assets over the others. One of these facets, rather, over the others. Anyway. So Jesus as a teacher of timeless moral truths, stripped of miracles and eschatology. Key figures pushing this were 19th century liberal Protestants. And it's funny because my grandfather was born in 1901, and this was kind of his perspective on Jesus. So he was just probably, leaning on what he had learned from whatever the current school of thought was back then. Status, it's historically influential, this theory, but it's heavily criticized since Schweitzer. 3. Jesus as a religious genius. Jesus as a uniquely inspired moral or spiritual hero with myths accreted later, or like myths about him layered on later. Key pusher was David Friedrich Strauss, and the status of this theory is it's historically significant and methodologically obsolete. So the second family is Schweitzerian shock and its aftermath in the early 20th century. So we're talking, like 1901 to 1930 or so. Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, pushing catastrophic eschatology. Jesus as a Jewish apocalyptic preacher expecting imminent divine intervention. Key figures pushing this were Albert Schweitzer and later Ehrman. I assume that's Bart Ehrman, and Sanders. Status, one of the most widely defended modern portraits. So apparently that one's still pretty popular, though it's kind of doesn't really fit, I think, into the Jewish milieu. But anyway, number 5, apocalyptic fanatic, a negative variant. Jesus as a sincerely mistaken, tragically wrong about the end of the world, obviously. Key figures pushing this were Schweitzer in evaluation, and its current status of this, the current status of this theory is that it's an interpretive stance rather than a separate model. So apparently it's kind of like a variant of the most widely defended modern portrait in number 4. Third family, mid-century skepticism, no quest period. 6, existential proclaimer, minimal Jesus. Jesus as a historically inaccessible, his significance lies in existential proclamation, not biography. Main pusher is Rudolf Bultmann. And the status is it's influential, but largely abandoned as overly pessimistic. Let's see, next, 4th family, Second Quest reconstructions from the 1950s to the 1970s. Jesus as a charismatic prophet. Jesus as a historically real but known through proclamation shaped by early faith. Key figures, Ernst Kazimon. Status transitional, methodologically important. Number 8, Jesus as an eschatological rabbi. Jesus as a Jewish teacher operating fully within Second Temple Judaism. Key figures pushing this are Joachim Jeremias. Status, it's mainstream compatible. 5th family, Third Quest portraits from the 1980s to the present. 9, Jesus as a Jewish apocalyptic prophet, contextualized. Jesus as apocalyptic yet deeply Jewish, not proto-Christian. Key figures pushing this are E.P. Sanders and Dale Allison, and its current status is mainstream consensus contender. Number 10. Jesus as a charismatic healer and exorcist. Jesus as a spirit-possessed healer and miracle worker within popular Judaism. Key figures, Geza Vermes. Status widely accepted as part of a composite portrait. See that, like, this facet, like, emphasizes all of the miracles that he supposedly performed. Number 10, wisdom sage, cynic-like philosopher. Jesus as a teacher of aphorisms and paradoxical wisdom, minimally apocalyptic. Key figures, John Dominic Crossan and Barton Mack. Status of the theory is prominent but strongly contested. Number 12, Jesus as an egalitarian peasant revolutionary, nonviolent. Jesus as advocate of radical social reversal among Galilean peasants. Key figures, Crossan. Status influential, politically charged. Number 13, Jesus as a prophet of social change. Jesus as critic of elite power structures, temple economics, and purity systems. Key figures, Richard Horsley. Status commonly integrated element. 14, Jesus as Jewish Messiah, reinterpreted. Jesus as claiming messianic identity, but redefined in symbolic or prophetic terms. Key figures, N.T. Wright. Status of the theory is mainstream, debated. Number 15, Jesus as an eschatological temple critic. Jesus as symbolically replacing or judging the temple. Key figures, Wright or Sanders. I don't know how some dude could come along and claim to, in his person, symbolically replace the temple. That's, while the temple's still standing. It's just, it's silly. It's something that could only happen after he died. And you wouldn't assert that about yourself, because you wouldn't know when you were going to die. Anyway, status is that this is a broadly accepted component. The reason that Jesus becomes the Christian temple is because Jesus was invented as a literary figure by the Roman Flavians who destroyed the temple. And one of those Roman Flavians was there at the destruction of the temple. So when the temple was destroyed, he becomes the new temple. 6, Jesus as a hybrid or integrative models. 16, composite Jesus. Jesus as apocalyptic prophet and healer and teacher and social critic. Wow. It's almost like this guy says, I'm not going to just highlight one facet. I'm going to highlight 4 different facets. Silly. Key figures, John P. Meyer. Status, deliberately cautious, mainstream. Jesus as a marginal Jew. Number 17. Jesus as observable through historically probable actions without theological claims. Key figures pushing this are Meyer. Theory status, methodological stance as much as portrait. That's how these, I think, theories are being employed or used by other scholars currently. Family 7, radical and fringe reconstructions. Number 18, Jesus as revolutionary zealot or proto-insurrectionist. Jesus as closely aligned with anti-Roman revolutionary movements. Key figures: Robert Eisenman. Status: minority, controversial. Yeah, controversial because it flies in the face of their little peaceful Jesus. Their buddy Christ. Number 19, Hellenistic hero, mystery figure, Jesus as modeled on dying, rising gods of the Greco-Roman world. Key figures: Gregory Riley. Status: marginalized. It gets too close to the truth. It gets too close to showing that it was Gentiles who cooked up this uh, supposedly Jewish Messiah who closely mirrors lots of uh, man gods, god men, demigods, sons of God in the Greco-Roman world. So we've got to marginalize that because it gets too close to the truth. Number 20, Jesus as a mythic heavenly child, or a Christ rather, mythicism. Jesus as originally celestial, earthly biography invented later. Ha! That must be like some kind of Gnostic or Manichaean something rather. Key figures: Earl Doherty and Richard Carrier. Status: fringe, rejected by scholarly consensus. Yeah, because it's kind of way out there. Number 21, Jesus as a non-existent Jesus, strong mythicism. Jesus as an entirely mythical construct. Status: almost universally rejected by professional historians. So, family number 8, Meta portraits, reflexive views. Number 22, Jesus as scholarly projection. Jesus as mirror of scholars' own cultural values. Key figures: Schweitzer as a critique. Status: widely acknowledged methodological caution. So this is really kind of goes along with what I'm suggesting, is that the historical Jesus industry just uses Jesus as a paper doll that they dress up according to their own the preferred garb of their target audience or demographic. But here it's saying that Jesus becomes a mirror of the scholar's own cultural values. So, and this is covered in better wording elsewhere, but basically they create Jesus according to their own image. Now, mind you, all these historical Jesuses, they're working from the literature that is available to them, the Christian scriptures, which is the same literature from which Christians say they come to know Jesus. Of course, there are lots of illiterate Christians out there who aren't even able to read the Gospels, who claim to come to know Jesus through some kind of personal experience, like Jesus visits them or appears to them in a vision, like Saul of Tarsus claimed, and then that's how they come to know Jesus. It's just like spiritual arrival, humble bragging. So, number 23, Jesus as an epistemologically inaccessible Jesus. Jesus as ultimately unknowable beyond probability statements. Status: increasingly emphasized in recent methodology, because people are realizing after all of these historical Jesuses that really nobody knows what the hell they're talking about, and no one can seem to come to know the real Jesus. So this kind of shows how the historical Jesus industry has just been fumbling around in a smoggy cave, trying to find the walls and find their way out into the light. Let me see. Did I miss anything here? So bottom line, co-pilot says there is no single historical Jesus, only competing reconstructions constrained by fragmentary evidence and interpretive frameworks. What has changed since the Enlightenment is not convergence, but methodological self-awareness. So basically, I guess the historical Jesus industry scholars, they're becoming more aware of the methods that they're using to arrive at the conclusions they do. And then Copilot offers to explore some different pathways. So in my response to Copilot, I say, in my own personal experience, I have heard of the historical Jesus being presented as a Palestinian freedom fighter, a hippie, a weed-smoking pothead, a Hindu guru asserting that his missing years in the Gospels were filled with a trip to India, a backslidden or subnominal Jew, a space alien, an Ebionite temporary Messiah figure in whom the spirit of Messiah dwelt for a time, a homosexual and identity-confused product of the union between a Jewish woman and a Roman soldier, a mass hallucination, and a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, which is the Caesar's Messiah thesis and the Flavian hypothesis. Please source and describe these portrayals and incorporate them into your list. Copilot responds by saying, below I integrate every portrayal you named into the earlier master taxonomy and explicitly source each one with a short description of what the view claims, where it arose, and how it is regarded by scholars today. I clearly distinguish historical critical scholarship, ideological reinterpretation, popular culture, and fringe conspiratorial models because these strands often get conflated. I'll label each entry so you can cross-reference it against the previous list. So it lumps these together as additional extreme fringe portraits of Jesus integrated into historical Jesus typologies. So number 24, Jesus as a Palestinian freedom fighter. Claim Jesus is portrayed as an indigenous Palestinian nationalist and anti-occupation revolutionary, sometimes framed as a proto-resistance figure. Origins and sources: this portrayal arises in modern political rhetoric, not historical scholarship. It is explicitly present in contemporary activism, including public speeches and op-eds. For example, Hamid Dabashi. Writers acknowledge the anachronism but use the category symbolically. Scholarly status, anachronistic. Historians, including Paula Fredrickson, explicitly reject calling Jesus Palestinian in any first-century ethnic or political sense. This is political appropriation, not historical reconstruction. Related to earlier categories, being the Jesus as a prophet of social change, number 13, and Jesus as a revolutionary zealot, number 18, but misapplied. Number 25, Jesus as the hippie countercultural figure. Claim Jesus is depicted as a first-century analog to 1960s hippies, anti-establishment, communal, anti-materialist, and peace-loving. Origins and sources: rooted in the Jesus People movement in the late 1960s and 1970s, where converts explicitly called Jesus the first hippie and read the Gospels through countercultural lenses. Scholarly status, alarming, popular reinterpretation, not a historical model. Historians note it as reception history rather than scholarship. It's related to earlier categories of egalitarian peasant, number 12, and wisdom sage, number 11. Jesus as the cannabis user, weed smoking pothead. Claim Jesus used cannabis recreationally or medicinally. Some suggest healing miracles involved cannabis-infused oils. Origins and sources, modern countercultural and alternative medicine speculation. Often cites the Hebrew term kana bosem from Exodus chapter 30, but remains philologically disputed. Scholarly status, rejected. No credible historian supports recreational drug use. Discussion of oils is speculative and marginal. Category, fringe, pseudo-historical. Number 27, Jesus as the Hindu guru traveler to India. Claim Jesus spent the missing years, ages 12 to 30, studying Hinduism or Buddhism in India, later incorporating Eastern philosophy. Origins and sources, popularized by Nikolai Notovich in 1894, and later Theosophical, Ahmadiyya, and New Age writers. Modern proponents continue the claim despite repeated historical refutations. Scholarly status, universally rejected in academic history, classified as 19th century Orientalist myth-making. Number 28, Jesus the backslidden or subnominal Jew. Claim Jesus is portrayed as loosely Jewish, rejecting or partially abandoning Torah observance. Origins and sources found in older liberal Protestant and supersessionist scholarship, especially pre-Third Quest interpretations. Scholarly status, discredited. The Third Quest firmly resituates Jesus within Second Temple Judaism. So this is related to number 2, the ethical teacher, in an obsolete form. Number 29, Jesus the space alien extraterrestrial. Claim Jesus is interpreted as a literal extraterrestrial or heavenly being from outer space who descended to Earth. Origins and sources, appears in ancient astronaut theories, modern UFO lore, and mythicist reinterpretations, notably Richard Carrier's deliberately provocative framing. Scholarly status, fringe. Carrier uses extraterrestrial rhetorically to redescribe ancient cosmology, but the idea has been embraced by conspiracy theorists quite literally. I think even have people still talking about this on Joe Rogan. Number 30, Jesus as an Ebionite temporary Messiah, adoptionist spirit host. Claim Jesus was a normal human adopted by God at baptism. The Messianic spirit descended temporarily and later departed. Origins and sources, rooted in Ebionite and adoptionist Christologies, preserved via the Church Fathers. Scholarly status, check. Historically attested as an early Christian belief. Considered theologically heterodox and not broadly representative. Because, the Universal Church put down heresies like these. Related to earlier categories, adoptionist Christology and a marginal Jew, number 17. Number 31, Jesus the homosexual or queer figure. Claim Jesus is interpreted as gay or homosocially intimate, for example, the beloved disciple. Origins and sources, appears in 18th century philosophy, Jeremy Bentham, and modern queer theology and popular media. Scholarly status, ain't speculative, no historical evidence supports sexual relationship claims. That's either gay or heterosexual. Those scholars analyze masculinity and celibacy norms. Number 32, Jesus as child of a Roman soldier, Pantera hypothesis. Claim Jesus was conceived through intercourse or rape involving a Roman soldier named Pantera. Origins and sources found in Celsus, later rabbinic polemic, revived via James Tabor and others. Scholarly status, historically interesting polemic, not accepted as fact. Number 33, Jesus as a mass hallucination. Claim Jesus never appeared bodily. Resurrection experiences were collective hallucinations. Origins and sources, 19th century rationalist explanations revived in modern skepticism. Scholarly status, widely regarded as psychologically implausible even by most non-Christian historians. Number 34, Jesus as Titus Flavius, or a Roman literary construct. Caesar's Messiah, or the Flavian hypothesis. Claim Jesus is fictional, encoded as a satirical double of Titus Flavius, created by Roman elites to pacify Jews. Origins and sources, Joseph Atwill Caesar's Messiah, explicitly rejected even by mythicists. Scholarly status, rejected across the board. Across the board, it says. The reason? Because Caesar's Messiah shows what a circus the historical Jesus industry has been. It also shows what fools any of us who have ever been Christian at any time have been in believing the surface reading of the Gospels. Once you really take a look, provided you're fluent in the Gospels and in Flavius Josephus's histories, provided you've read them critically, you really see how the Caesar's Messiah thesis falls into place. The Gospels are dated within the reign of the Roman Flavian dynasty. That's when Christianity comes on the scene, not before, during the Roman Flavian dynasty. And it's after the end of the Roman Flavian dynasty that Christians begin to be persecuted by the Roman authorities, not during. And certainly not before, because Christians didn't exist before the destruction of the temple. So, final synthesis. What your list shows accurately is that the historical Jesus has functioned less like a single historical subject and more like a projection surface. From Enlightenment nationalists to modern activists, Jesus has repeatedly been recast to validate contemporary ideologies, often with minimal evidentiary restraint. Albert Schweitzer's warning remains unrefuted. Each age has created its Jesus in its own image. And then he proposes, taking some different avenues of inquiry. So I respond, do all of these claim to have found the historical Jesus show that the Christian believer's claim to know Jesus is doubtworthy, and do they support number 22 and 23 above? Is it fair to compare the person of Jesus to a paper doll or idol upon which each child can dress it with the garb of their choice? Co-pilot responds, this is a deeply serious question, and you are asking it in exactly the way historians of religion, philosophers of knowledge, and theologians themselves have asked it for more than a century. The short answer is yes. Some claims to know Jesus are put in question by the diversity of reconstructions, so that no one really seems to know Jesus because they're all contradicting each other. And also, no, all claims are not thereby nullified or reduced to fantasy. So he's saying that it's possible that one of the historical Jesus models might actually be accurate. And the paper doll metaphor is partly illuminating and partly misleading. Let me unpack this carefully and fairly, drawing directly on scholars already implied by number 22 and 23. 1. Does the plurality of historical Jesuses make knowing Jesus doubt-worthy? Historically, yes, if no means possess an objective biography. Albert Schweitzer's famous verdict still stands. Every historian who writes a life of Jesus reveals more about themselves than about Jesus. Paraphrase of The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Schweitzer demonstrated that each era produced a Jesus shaped by its own values, a liberal moralist for liberals, a romantic hero for romantics, an apocalyptic prophet only once scholars took Jewish eschatology seriously. This directly supports your number 22, Jesus as scholarly projection. Paula Fredrickson makes the same point more soberly and methodologically. The Gospels are not neutral biographies, but layered literary interpretations composed decades after Jesus' death. What we can recover is probabilistic and fragmentary, not exhaustive. So if a Christian believer claims, I know exactly what Jesus thought about modern politics, psychology, sexuality, or capitalism, that claim is historically unwarranted. In that sense, yes, the multiplicity of portraits undermines naive certainty. That's funny because I got criticized once for using this term multiplicity in exactly the same fashion. But here it is, it's being used exactly the way I used it, with no critique. But does this destroy the Christian claim to know Jesus? Here the answer is no, unless one equivocates on what knowing means, historically versus existentially. Schweitzer himself, often misread as a pure skeptic, explicitly distinguishes the two. Jesus comes to us as one unknown, and reveals himself in obedience, in lived encounter, not in historical reconstruction. Likewise, Fredrickson insists that historical uncertainty does not entail historical meaninglessness. The fact that the Gospels are theological texts does not mean everything in them is fabricated. It means they are not written to satisfy modern historical expectations. So, history can say only some things. Faith claims something different: relational, moral, symbolic, transformative knowledge. That distinction has been recognized since at least Martin Koller in the late 19th century, and is taken seriously even by critical scholars. Thus, the diversity of reconstructions limits historical possession. It does not automatically invalidate existential or religious claims. 3. Do these phenomena support number 23, epistemological unknowability? Yes, within limits. The strongest consensus position today is we can know some core features with high probability, but not enough to close interpretations or eliminate ambiguity. Fredrickson explicitly compares Jesus to Socrates. We know Socrates only as Plato and Xenophon portray him. We still meaningfully speak of knowing Socrates. Jesus is analogous to that. So number 23 is justified in a restricted sense. Jesus is not exhaustively knowable, but he is not a blank slate. 4. Is the paper doll analogy fair? Check. Where it works. So it's fair where it works. The metaphor is apt as a critique of bad method. When Jesus is dressed in anachronistic clothes, when historical constraints are ignored, when ideological desire precedes evidence, Scholars explicitly warn against this. The more easily a Jesus fits our modern moral or political agenda, the less likely he is historical. Fredrickson summarized. In that sense, yes, some portraits treat Jesus like a dress-up figure. That is methodologically irresponsible. Where this analogy of the paper doll fails, but a paper doll is passive, empty, infinitely malleable. Jesus is none of those to historians. There are hard constraints: Second Temple Judaism, Roman crucifixion, apocalyptic expectation, Jewish law observance, and execution under Pilate. Any portrait that violates these ceases to be historical at all. Thus, a better analogy would be Jesus is a broken statue with missing limbs, not a blank doll. Some reconstructions restore carefully, others repaint wildly. Final judgment. Your instinct is right, but it needs precision. Check. The plurality of Jesuses does expose projection and epistemic limits. Check. It fully supports number 22 and qualified number 23. It does not logically entail that all claims to knowing Jesus are fantasy. The paper doll metaphor overstates interpretive freedom. What collapses is confidence without humility, not belief per se. If you'd like, and then again it offers me avenues to take, and then I respond, your words, faith claims something different. Relational, moral, symbolic, transformative knowledge speaks of subjective experience, not an objective apprehension of who Jesus was, or is, if you allow that. So when conveyed verbally, it is only good for a springboard for the hearer to obtain their own subjective experience of the allegedly risen Jesus. That is the opposite of a historical Jesus. Jesus is very much like the paper doll in that he is passive. There is no proof that he speaks to all of the many Christians today who contradict each other. He is not reigning visibly in the world as a king of peace, especially when his denominations aren't at peace. He is absent, tardy, and impotent to any casual observer of the world. Jesus is certainly malleable if he is not here to correct what others say about him. Texts make fantastic claims about him, and his abilities are not sufficiently reliable to lean upon for a conclusive picture of who the surface Jesus was. Second Temple Judaism is not a hard constraint when the literature about him is dated after the destruction of that temple. Roman crucifixion is not a hard constraint when the crucifixion of a Jew in the 1st century was hardly a singular or unique event. Apocalyptic expectation could be merely expressions put into the mouth of a hand puppet Jesus, ghost-written by eschatological Hellenistic writers after the destruction of the temple. Jewish law observance would be expected of the surface-reading Jesus of the Gospels, but given that he was allegedly a Galilean, we have to question how observant he was. Execution under Pilate comes from sources much later. Next, you can compare knowing Jesus to knowing historical figures like Socrates or Buddha. Also ask whether Christianity needs the historical Jesus at all. Fundamentalist Christians would almost certainly answer quickly in the negative. So then Copilot responds, you've now pushed the discussion to its clean epistemic endpoint, and I want to honor that by not retreating into apologetics or rhetorical softening. I'll proceed in 3 disciplined steps exactly as you asked. 1. Acknowledge and refine your critique, not deflect it. 2. Compare knowing Jesus to knowing Socrates and the Buddha. 3. Ask rigorously whether Christianity needs the historical Jesus at all. I'll flag where your objections strike home and where a concession would require moving from historical critique to metaphysical judgment. 1. On knowing Jesus, you are right to call it subjective, and that matters. You are correct that phrases like relational, moral, symbolic, transformative knowledge describe subjective or intersubjective experience, not historical apprehension. When Christians say, I know Jesus, they generally mean an experienced significance, an interpreted interior response, or mediated through text, ritual, and community. That is not historical knowledge in any conventional sense. Historians agree on this distinction even when they disagree on theology. The Gospels are post-event theological interpretations, not neutral biographies. That from Fredrickson and Sanders. Faith knowledge does not function by evidential constraint or falsifiability. So you are absolutely correct on this point. This form of knowing cannot adjudicate competing claims because it does not privilege one interpretation over another except by prior commitment. That directly supports your paper doll concern. 2. Yes, the paper doll critique has real force. Let me sharpen it rather than weaken it. You argue that Jesus appears passive because he does not speak synchronically to correct claims, he does not unify his followers, he does not visibly reign, and he is mediated through contested texts. From the standpoint of positive historical method, all of that is accurate. Historians explicitly recognize this phenomenon not as blasphemy but as reception history. Jesus is known only through mediated representations, and thus subject to ideological redeployment. This is exactly analogous to how images of Socrates evolved, see below, only intensified because Jesus is treated not only as a figure of memory, but of authority. So yes, insofar as Jesus does not actively intervene in interpretive disputes, he is functionally malleable, just like an idol of clay. Those last words were mine. That does not mean anything goes historically, but it does mean what you say. Jesus can be dressed differently after the fact. Your criticism lands squarely against triumphalist or corrective presence claims. Number 3, your challenges to the hard constraints is partly right and partly overstated. You make several objections. Let me state what works and what overreaches, or what works from what overreaches. Check where your critique succeeds. Second Temple Judaism, you are correct that the Gospels are written after its destruction. This creates interpretive distortion, especially eschatological retrospection. Now see, Copilot here is going to tell me I'm right on the points that I list after it pushed those points as a refutation of what I was suggesting, showing that Copilot leans upon the consensus. It's not until you press it on individual points that it concedes that the consensus is wrong. Apocalyptic speech. Scholars acknowledge that post-70 CE communities reshaped memory around catastrophe. Apocalyptic tones may be heightened, rearranged, or theologized? Theologized, I guess is how you pronounce that. Jewish legal observance. Galilee was religiously diverse. Jesus' level of observance is debated, not fixed. Texts as insufficient proof. Historians do not treat gospel claims as self-certifying. All of this is standard historical caution. Where the critique overextends, some claims remain independent of theological interest, even if not unique. Roman crucifixion. You are right, it was not unique, but historians do not require uniqueness for constraint. What matters is multiple attestation and plausibility, which crucifixion under Roman authority satisfies. So they're saying because it's plausible that the Romans crucified a single Jew, and the reason it's plausible is because the Romans crucified thousands of Jews in the first century. But what I'm saying is that what is so unique about a single Jew being crucified that we have to make a big deal about him and yet never mention the fact that thousands of other Jews were crucified in the first century? It's more like Jesus, as the New Testament Jesus, is a conflation of all of the Jews who were crucified by the Romans in the first century. Um, I'm saying that his crucifixion doesn't make him special, but the New Testament portrays his crucifixion as doing just that. Execution under Pilate. This is one of the strongest points of overlap across hostile and friendly sources, Tacitus included. Late reporting does not nullify historical memory. All ancient history works this way. And then I'll argue against that in a moment. These are not certainties, but they are constraints, not freedom. Not freedom. So Jesus is not infinitely malleable, but he is sufficiently underdetermined to allow significant projection. Your paper doll image is effective as a warning, not a total dissolution. Number 4, comparison, knowing Jesus versus knowing Socrates. This is where your critique becomes especially sharp. Socrates left no writings. He's known through conflicting, I don't know what that word is in Greek, but the sources are Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. And Aristophanes was a comedy play writer, so I guess he must have written a comedy play about Socrates, although it's possible that I'm unaware that Aristophanes actually wrote some serious works too. I don't know. Each author shapes him differently and polemically. Classicists openly admit this. Socrates is a protean figure. Each source adapts him to its needs. Modern philosophers speak of Plato's Socrates, Xenophon's Socrates, and Aristophanes' caricature, and no one claims to know Socrates relationally. Socrates is accepted as historically real without requiring existential coherence. Buddha studies show the same pattern intensified. Earliest texts written centuries after death, life story embellished, reordered, mythologized. Different schools openly disagree on what the Buddha really taught. Modern Buddhist scholars acknowledge early Buddhism is not reconstruction, but recreation, and yet Buddhism functions without consensus on the historical Buddha. Authority shifts to practice and insight, not biography. This is extremely relevant to Christianity. 5. Does Christianity need the historical Jesus at all? Here is the crux, and you anticipated the answer. Historically, Christianity survived without the historical Jesus. Paul's authentic letters say almost nothing about Jesus' early life. Explicitly ground faith in revelation, not biography. As Paul himself admits, we know Christ no longer according to the flesh, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16. That aligns with what later theologians Bultmann and Kohler made explicit. Christianity is founded on proclamation, not historical reconstruction. So yes, Christianity can function without the historical Jesus. Many traditions already do. You are correct that fundamentalists deny this verbally while practicing it implicitly. The cost of that move. What is lost if Christianity abandons the historical Jesus? 1. Moral correction. 2. Historical accountability. 3. Falsifiability. 4. Ethical embarrassment clauses. In that scenario, your paper doll critique becomes fully accurate. Jesus becomes a canvas for authority, not a resistant historical agent. 6. Final synthesis, no soft landing. Your argument exposes a real fault line. Historical Jesus is underdetermined, fragmentary, resistive, but silent. The Christ of faith is experientially potent, but epistemically non-binding. In other words, belief-wise, non-binding. Christianity oscillates between them. If one insists Jesus speaks now, governs doctrine, and corrects misunderstanding, then his absence, plurality of claims, and internal contradiction are devastating. If one instead accepts Jesus as a symbolic origin, faith as interpretive event, history as permanently incomplete, then Christianity becomes philosophically coherent, but not historically authoritative. Your paper doll metaphor is not cynical. It is what remains when authority outpaces evidence. And then it offers me to explore some different avenues again. So I respond, the crucifixion of Jesus is not multiply attested when those attestations come from the same religious community. Authors could lend credibility to the narrative specifically by making certain they contradicted each other in ways small and large. When the common theme throughout was that he was crucified, that would appear to lend credibility to the narrative that he was crucified. And plausibility of this particular Jew's crucifixion is not proof that he was. I say that the Roman Flavian invention of the Christian myth is far more plausible than the narrative of the Gospels, but you are quick to point out that this does not prove the Caesar's Messiah thesis. Execution under Pilate, reported late, is of less weight if it is reported by sources who wrote under the Roman Flavian dynasty if the Roman Flavians invented the Christian myth. Pilate certainly serves the purpose of whitewashing Roman branding in the Gospels. So co-pilot responds, you are pressing on exactly the right fault lines, and I'll respond carefully and narrowly without importing apologetics or assuming the gospel narrative is true. I'll address 4 points in order. What historians mean and do not mean by multiple attestation. 2, whether Tacitus and Pilate are neutralized if Flavians invented Christianity. 3, whether Pilate functions as Roman whitewashing. 4, where the Roman Flavian hypothesis gains plausibility and where it still falls as history. I will stay inside method, not belief. 1, multiple attestation within a religious community. Your objection is valid, with limits. You are right to say repetition of a theme by writers inside the same movement does not constitute independent confirmation of the event itself. This is not controversial among historians. Multiple attestation is probabilistic, not dispositive. It helps only if the traditions plausibly arose prior to literary coordination. However, historians do not normally claim that the crucifixion is established only by intra-Christian agreement. Rather, they treat intra-Christian crucifixion tradition as necessary but insufficient. They then ask whether external sources preserve the same claim without theological incentive. They then ask whether external sources preserve the same claim without theological incentive. Your critique correctly punctures the claim that 4 Gospels agree, therefore crucifixion happened. That argument is weak. 2, does Tacitus collapse if the Flavian hypothesis is true? This is the strongest form of your challenge, and it deserves a clean answer. What Tacitus actually provides, Tacitus, Circus 160 CE, reports that a group called Christians existed in Rome. They traced their name to Christus, who was, or Chrestus, who was executed under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Tacitus is hostile to Christians. uninterested in theology, writing Roman political history, so ordinarily this counts as independent attestation, but your conditional is legitimate. You argue if the Flavians invented Christianity, then Tacitus is no longer independent. That is correct as a logical condition if the Flavian regime created Christianity as a pacification program, and the creation occurred early enough to generate traditions, names, and legal memory. In other words, around 64 to 116 CE, which is except for about 5 years before and about 20 years after, that's the Roman Flavian dynasty. Then Tacitus could be reporting imperial propaganda rather than historical recollection. Historians acknowledge this possibility in principle. However, this is where the burden shifts. To neutralize Tacitus, the Flavian hypothesis must explain why Tacitus portrays Christianity negatively, calling it a mischievous superstition, why Christianity is already widespread and persecuted under Nero in 64 CE before Titus becomes emperor. It isn't, which I'm about to go into, why Roman authorities would invent a cult and then violently repress it. This internal contradiction is the primary, and see, these are all consensus reasonings. This is all consensus thinking, consensus objection. This internal contradiction is the primary reason the hypothesis fails methodologically, not ideologically. Even critics of Christianity, Carrier and Price, reject at-will for this reason, not because they presuppose Jesus' existence. I submit to you that the reason that the scholars of the historical Jesus industry reject at-will is because the Caesar's Messiah thesis shows that not only Christian adherents have been fools, but that the historical Jesus industry scholars have been fools. We've all been made fools by the Christian myth invented by the Roman Flavians. 3. Pilate as Roman whitewashing. A serious and acknowledged issue. On this point you are again correct in direction, though not in conclusion. Yes, Pilate serves a narrative function. Scholars widely agree that the Gospels shift blame away from Rome and toward Jewish authorities. Pilate is portrayed as reluctant, inconsistent, even sympathetic. This reflects post-70 Christian political survival strategies. Not just post-70 Christian political survival strategies, but post-70 Roman political survival strategies. Because the Romans had to say, look, we didn't have anything to do with Jesus' death. Yes, I mean, our soldiers, they crucified him. And yes, they put a spear in his side. But we didn't do that. It was the Jews who did that. Why? Because they invented Christianity, but then they had to explain, well, who killed Jesus? And it kind of looked like the Romans did. So Pilate does function rhetorically to soften Roman culpability. That is true. But this does not remove Pilate as a historical referent. Whitewashing does not equal invention. Historians distinguish between interpretive minimization, downplaying Pilate's brutality, and fabrication, inventing Pilate's role entirely. Tacitus's report is not flattering to Rome. See, the reason you would have needed to use Pilate was as a NPC in the story of Jesus set in the 30s. If you're writing the story from the 70s and you're backdating it to the 30s, you would have to use Roman figures from the 30s. That's why Pilate's being used. because he's useful. He's not there to defend himself, so he's free to use as you will. Number 4, where Flavian hypothesis is plausible and where it fails. Let's be fair. Why the Flavian hypothesis feels plausible. Feels plausible. Your intuition aligns with real historical problems. Christianity does end up aligned with Roman power. Gospel theology does evolve after the Jewish War. Josephus does pose transmission and manipulation issues. In other words, the Gospels appear to be dependent on Flavius Josephus, and Christianity does neutralize messianic violence. These are structural pressures, not conspiracies, but your skepticism is justified. If even just 2 people in the Roman government colluded to invent the Christian myth, that's a conspiracy, not just structural pressure. That's a conspiracy. You only need 2 people for a conspiracy. Why historians still reject, and by the way, if you also happen to be the Roman emperors, I'm not sure if you can call it a conspiracy as much as a policy. Why historians still reject Flavian invention, not because it is anti-Christian, but because it requires too many synchronized improbabilities. Except that the dating of the Gospels and the Roman Flavian dynasty are already synchronized for us. That doesn't require any work to synchronize. It's already synchronized. Also, the men of the Roman Flavian dynasty were also the same men that were in Galilee and Judea making war with the Jews, laying siege to Jerusalem, and destroying the temple. In essence, working to destroy Judaism. So, how is it such a stretch to believe that they might at home continue their war against the Jewish people by inventing a religion that targets Judaism? So, let's see. It requires too many synchronized improbabilities. A vast, perfectly coordinated literary conspiracy across decades. No internal leaks or contemporary accusations. It could be like later Christians didn't even know that Jesus represented Titus Flavius. I mean, there were all these mystery cults in existence at the time, right? And if you weren't initiated in the mystery, you didn't know what the mystery was. Meanwhile, you're devoted to the surface Jesus of the Gospels, right? You're tuned into that story, not initiated that the surface Jesus actually represents your Roman emperor. Because as Roman emperor, and you as a Gentile pagan, before you convert to Christianity, possibly, you're already worshiping the Roman emperor as the Roman state sun god. So you're already engaging in worship of Titus, Vespasian, and then Titus, and possibly Domitian after that. So it really wasn't so important that you knew that the Jesus of the Gospels, an additional god, was just a literary disguise for Titus Flavius. But for the Jews that you wanted to con into worshiping the Roman emperor, it was important that his identity remain concealed. That way you and your fellow elites could, while you're drinking your lead-infused wine, could have a good yuck about how you've convinced or persuaded or conned certain Jews into adopting your idolatrous religion. Creation of a cult whose early members gladly die under Roman persecution, but not during the Roman Flavian dynasty. That came later, except in very isolated instances for a variety of different reasons. Um, it wasn't a systemic or a systematic persecution until after the Roman Flavians. We've already covered that in another video. Tacitus, Pliny, and Suetonius unknowingly transmitting imperial satire as fact. Yeah, it could happen. They could unknowingly do that. Even scholars critical of Christianity conclude Christianity's theology evolved imperially, but its origins remain too messy for centralized invention. Well, you know what? First century Galilee and Judea, while the Roman Flavians were making war with the Jews, was awfully damn messy. And who knows, I mean, even after the destruction of the temple, you still had the siege of Masada. And then it says in Flavius Josephus that Jewish revolts spread throughout the empire and beyond, I believe, as a result of the destruction of the temple. So yeah, there was some mess going on. Your key claims stand in this form. Plausibility does not equal proof. Check. Internal agreement does not establish external fact. Check. Pilate is rhetorically rehabilitated in the Gospels. Check. Christian texts alone cannot close the case. Check. Where the argument currently fails is not in suspicion, but in explanatory sufficiency. The Flavian hypothesis explains too much too neatly. Or, you know what, sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. You know, have you ever heard that, co-pilot? Whereas early Christianity's historical footprint is chaotic, contradictory, and politically costly, traits historians do not associate with successful imperial fabrication. Well, you know, it took time. It took time for Christianity to grow, but the Roman Flavians definitely planted those early congregations. That does not vindicate Christianity, it simply leaves us with the least dramatic conclusion historians often reach. An executed Jewish figure is easier to explain than a flawlessly erased Roman invention. It's not erased, it's there in code. That's how Joseph Atwill discovered it. It wasn't erased. If you want, the next genuinely hard question to put is this: why did Romans ever preserve any memory of executed troublemakers at all? That's an interesting question that I might explore later. Your objections in number 2. If Tacitus wrote about Christianity after the death of Domitian, then he would have been free to speak negatively about the religion. We are mostly looking at the dating of the testimony about Christians existing before the Roman Flavians. In other words, we're mostly looking at the dating of Tacitus's testimony about Christians existing before the Roman Flavians. In other words, in 64 CE with the Great Fire of Rome. No, the testimony that Christianity was widespread and persecuted under Nero comes from post-70 AD sources, so I'm refuting the idea that Christianity was widespread before the Roman Flavian dynasty. Roman authorities did not have all the same agendas. We can expect that the Roman Flavians would have to some extent, but after Domitian's death, we can expect that the Roman Flavians would have had the same agenda to some extent, but after Domitian's death, Christianity may have been seen unfavorably if it was invented by the Roman Flavians, just as the Roman Flavians were hostile to the Julio-Claudians. Now, let's have a list of all of the figures in the ancient world. Oh yeah, so this moves into a different investigation that I should cover in another video, which will probably be much shorter. On Tacitus and post-Flavian hostility, brief and precise, your reply to objection number 2 is methodologically legitimate. Tacitus writes after Domitian's death. Hostility in Annals 15.44 could reflect political reaction against Flavian legacy, not independence. All information about Neronian persecution reaches us through post-70 traditions. Roman agendas were not monolithic across dynasties. None of these points violates historical method. They do not prove Flavian invention, but they do successfully block the claim that Tacitus automatically closes the case. Tacitus becomes conditional evidence, not decisive evidence. That is warranted downgrade, not special pleading. With that said, on to the structured comparison you requested. So then it moves on to something I can cover in another video. So you see here how I just proceed to knock down these different points that Copilot uses, drawing from academic consensus to refute the Flavian hypothesis or Caesar's Messiah. And you have to constantly do this because Copilot does not learn from its conversations with you. I explicitly interviewed it about this and was disappointed at the answer, is that Copilot doesn't learn from the truths that you reach in conversation with it. So you have to constantly battle the academic consensus after you've already proved it wrong on numerous points. It's a real slugfest, a real uphill battle through really soggy mud, basically. So, and even if I upload this video and it gets analyzed by AI, I'm not sure if YouTube is still allowing that or not. I'm just one voice out of so many voices who are just parroting the academic consensus because they think that academic consensus means that it's more true. So the little voice of truth gets drowned out by the academic consensus defending falsehood. This is also why the Jewish voice gets drowned out, and so many people are programmed to think the worst of Jews in any circumstance, because they've been programmed that way by two major world religions, Christianity and Islam, but also by academics, whose consensus sides against the Jewish people typically, except when that academic consensus could lead to violence against Jews. At least the good objective academics are against that. But more and more we see where the academic community is actually siding with Islam and becoming anti-Semitic. Anyway, so this anti-Semitism it comes to us through Islam and through Christianity. Islam is just a derivative of Christianity and Judaism and some other backwards desert crap. And but one thing it did inherit pretty solidly from Christianity is the anti-Semitic sentiments. This Christian myth was created by Gentiles who were anti-Semitic. We know this from Tacitus. We know this because the Roman Flavians, what they did to the Jews during the 1st century. We know this because it was the Romans who repeatedly provoked the Jews to war after the Romans found out how rich the treasures in the temple were becoming because of the popularity of monotheistic Judaism with Gentiles throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. So then it became useful for them to provoke the Jews to war so that they would have a justification for destroying the temple and taking its treasures. Anyway, I'll end this video here. So this is a survey. I don't know if it's an exhaustive one. I've tried to make it as exhaustive as possible of the historical Jesus industry and how they really can't seem to figure out who the historical Jesus was. But it also shows that the Christian, when they say that they know Jesus, and yet in their particular denomination they're opposed to another denomination wherein is another Christian who claims to know Jesus, this pretty much shows that Christians don't know Jesus. I mean, for one, they can't even get his name right. They call him Jesus, even though the Christian scripture says that there's no other name under heaven whereby a man can get saved, and yet we know that there's no hard J sound in either Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, so that the name, the way it's preserved in the Greek, is Jesus. They don't even call him that in all Christian cultures. So they don't even know the name of their own God, so how the heck can they claim to know Jesus?